everybody, Suz here. Welcome to another Keto Dinner Ideas video. Today we are doing keto chicken recipes, and all of these keto chicken recipes are under 6 net grams of carbs. If you're new here, we make these videos every single week. I'd love for you to hit the subscribe button, join our crew. Let's go ahead and get into it. First up this week on our keto chicken recipes, we made this broccoli cheese stuffed chicken breast. These was so delicious. The original recipe from I Wash You Dry, I'll link down below. I used her ingredients for the most part, but did change up her cooking method to make it a little easier. So to start with, in a medium mixing bowl, I'm adding 1 cup of chopped up broccoli. I just used frozen broccoli florets that I thawed and ran through a mini processor, along with a 1/2 cup of red bell pepper that I also ran through the mini chopper. 1 cup of shredded sharp cheddar cheese. I did use pre-shredded, but make sure you shred your own to save on carbs. 1 tablespoon of avocado oil keto-friendly mayo, which I use Chosen Foods. 1 teaspoon of garlic powder, 1/4 a teaspoon sea salt, 1/4 a teaspoon ground black pepper. And I'm just gonna mix this up really well until everything is nice and combined. And this is what we are going to use to actually stuff our chicken breast. Now, sticking that to the side, I'm putting together a seasoning blend for our chicken by mixing together 1/4 a teaspoon paprika with a 1/2 a teaspoon garlic powder. Just giving that a good stir with my measuring spoon. Now we're using 3 large chicken breasts for this recipe, and I'm just sprinkling each of them with a little sea salt, little ground black pepper, and then I'm gonna sprinkle half of this seasoning mix over all 3 of my chicken breasts. And I always like to sprinkle the seasoning with one hand and then rub it in with the other. Flipping those over, I'm gonna just repeat the process on the other side. Again with my sea salt, my ground black pepper, and the rest of that paprika garlic powder seasoning blend. The original recipe that again I'll have linked down below, she went ahead and cut slits into her chicken at this point and stuffed it and then seared it. I was like, I will mess this recipe up if I try to cook it that way. All of the stuffing will fall out. It's just, that's a lot of work. So I decided to sear my chicken breast before I filled them. So on a large skillet over medium-high heat on the stove, have a few tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, and I'm just using my tongs to stick the chicken in. And I'm just gonna sear it for a couple of minutes on this side, flipping it over, getting a nice sear on the other side as well. This is just gonna make our chicken taste more flavorful when we finish it off in the oven, and it's gonna help lock in that moisture. Now I'm gonna remove the chicken breast to a large cutting board and let them rest for just a couple minutes before going ahead and slicing the pockets for our stuffing. So I'm just holding the chicken breast with a fork and using a knife to cut long ways. Make sure you don't cut all the way through the back side of your chicken. Just want it to be a nice little pocket like this. And I always find it the easiest to cut on the straightest edge of the chicken. Just helps me get a nice even cut. Just makes things work a little bit better. Now here is our mixture. I'm gonna divide this evenly among the 3 chicken breasts. And again, you're just kind of opening it up and plopping that broccoli and pepper mixture right on in. Now I'm taking a 9x13 baking dish, spraying it with a little olive oil cooking spray, and once all of my chicken breasts are filled, I'm just gonna line those up in there. And then at this point, any remnants of the filling I have left over, I'll go ahead and add evenly to each one. Covering this with aluminum foil, popping it to a 425-degree oven for about 20 minutes. And here's what they look like when they come out. These smell delicious, and look at this. This is so good, and it was actually so easy to put together. You could even do your prep work for this recipe ahead of time. Definitely recommend trying that. Next up on our keto chicken recipes, we made this awesome low-carb chicken Parmesan in a skillet, and this is from Low Carb Maven. As always, original recipe linked down below. So to start with, I'm using 2 large chicken breasts that I cut in half for this recipe, put them into a freezer bag, and I'm just pounding them out with a meat mallet to about, I don't know, 1/2 inch thickness. In a plate, I'm adding 1 cup of crushed pork rinds. I always just do a couple bags of these in a food processor and stick them in a plastic container for when I need them. To those, I'm adding a teaspoon dried oregano, a teaspoon dried basil, 1/4 a teaspoon garlic powder, 1/4 a teaspoon onion powder, 1/4 a teaspoon sea salt, and 1/4 a teaspoon ground black pepper. And I'm just gonna use a fork and kind of toss this all together until it's evenly combined. Now in a salad dish, which I find is perfect for dipping your chicken in, I'm beating 2 large eggs. On our stove top, I'm using cast cast iron, and I just have my setup here with my crumbs and my egg mixture. Added a few tablespoons of olive oil to my cast iron on medium-high heat. And then I'm using a fork to dip my chicken into my egg mixture, and then just make sure you let any of the excess egg drip off of that, and then putting it over into our pork rind seasoning blend. So just repeating that process for all of our chicken breasts. And for her recipe, she made this as 6 servings. So I think she did like 3 chicken breasts and cut them in half. I just wanted to do the 2 so they would fit perfectly in my pan. And once I have them in there, I'm gonna just cook them for about 3 to 4 minutes on each side. And once I had these flipped over, I did go ahead and cut the heat off on my pan, and I'm just gonna pour in all of the extra seasoning and pork rind crumb mixture that we have left over. And because I'm only making this 4 servings instead of 6, I am decreasing the amount of marinara sauce she uses. I'm using Rayo's. She used 2 full cups. I'm just using 1 cup, 1/4 a cup on each chicken breast. And then I'm gonna pop this whole thing into a 350-degree oven for 20 minutes. And after it comes out of the oven the first go around, I am taking a 1/2 cup of grated Parmesan cheese and dividing that evenly among each piece of chicken, along with 1 cup of shredded mozzarella cheese. And then I'm just gonna pop this back into the oven for another 5 to 10 minutes for our cheese to melt all the way. You could even put it under the broiler if you wanted your cheese to get more brown on top. She covers hers with oiled aluminum foil and all of that, but I just put it in uncovered, and that worked perfectly for me without all of the extra hassle. And here it is after it comes out of the oven. Oh my gosh, this was so good. I did opt to serve it over a little tiny bit of steamed zucchini, steamed zoodles. I always just cook these from frozen in the microwave for a couple minutes, and this was even delicious left over, of course. Next up, we made this keto chicken pot pie from kickingcarbs.com. I made this more for my husband as it has mushrooms in it, and I am not a fan of mushrooms. So in a large pot over medium heat, I'm adding a 1/2 cup of butter, which is just 1 whole stick. Once that's nice and melted, I'm adding 1 cup of chopped up white mushrooms, along with 1/3 of a cup of chopped yellow onion. Just stirring that around a little bit before adding some sea salt to this. Now, she called for a teaspoon of sea salt, and I only put a 1/2 teaspoon in, and I regret that. So maybe go ahead and add the whole teaspoon. I'm also putting in a 1/4 of a teaspoon of ground black pepper and stirring that around, and I'm gonna let this cook down for about 5 minutes. After it does, I'm adding in chicken broth. I added 1 3/4 a cup, and I used reduced sodium chicken broth, along with 2/3 a cup of heavy whipping cream. And then I'm just going to bring this to a boil and stir it constantly for 1 minute. Then I just cut the heat off and added 1 teaspoon of xanthan gum, and I went ahead and whisked that in as well. And I find that you don't need to add this to a little bit of liquid separately and then put it into your pot like you would with cornstarch. The xanthan gum just mixes in perfectly fine for me, just adding it to the entire pot. And then I let it cook for another 5 minutes, and then I am adding in 3 cups of shredded chicken. I always just do a couple chicken breast in the Instant Pot and then shred it with a handheld mixer, and I'm mixing that in really well. Now we're cooking this in an 8x8 baking dish. I just poured it straight from the pot in there, and we're gonna stick it to the side while we make our crust. And to do that, in a bowl, I have 5 ounces of mozzarella cheese, which equals out to about 1.5 cups, along with 2 ounces of cream cheese. And then I opted to stray from the original recipe a little and add a tablespoon of butter because I like the way that makes your fathead dough more pliable and easier to work with. Popped it into the microwave for a minute, and then I'm giving it a nice stir. Popped it back in the microwave in another 30 seconds, and then it's the absolute perfect texture to go ahead and add our 3/4 of a cup almond flour. Now, a lot of people say they prefer to just put the almond flour in with the mixture and heat it in the microwave all together. I just don't like doing mine that way, but you do what works for you. Taking a big spoon, I just like to go ahead and work the almond flour into the cheese mixture as well as I can before adding 1 beaten egg, along with a teaspoon of dried thyme. And then we're just gonna mix this together really, really well. And once I have that all mixed, I'm just turning it out onto a piece of parchment paper, topping it with another piece, and then I'm just gonna use my hands to try to put this into the shape we need, which is at 8x8. We're just gonna be laying this over the top of our casserole dish. I pulled out a rolling pin in case I need it, but when you add that little bit of butter to your fathead dough, you really don't need a rolling pin at that point. It's just so much easier to work with. So I have that mashed out. I see it's a little too thin in some areas, so I'm gonna just use my hands to kind of rake across the parchment until I I can get it even, and then pulling the top part off. And we're gonna grab our casserole dish, and I'm just plopping this over the top of it. Now, my dough did stick to that other piece of parchment a tiny bit, which was no worries. I mean, just pulled it off. I didn't need it to be perfect. So, but you could easily prevent that by spraying that with a little cooking oil before you turned your dough out onto it. I've never had this happen before. This is a different kind of parchment paper than I usually use. I don't know if that had something to do with it or not, but all worked out in the end. I'm just gonna tuck that excess dough in here around the edges and use a little paper towel to go ahead and wipe off the dough off of the handle so that it doesn't cook on there. Cutting a little slit into the middle of this to help it vent. And then I'm gonna pop this whole thing into a 350-degree oven for 30 minutes. Here's what it looks like when it comes out of the oven. So beautiful. Again, I just tasted this because I don't like the mushrooms in it, and I did think it needed a little bit more salt or something to give it a little bit more kind of pizzazz. Maybe add a little salt to the crust, as well as adding that whole teaspoon of salt to the chicken. But my husband loved it, and he's who I was cooking it for, so that's what counts. But this would be great for meal prepping and having in the refrigerator for the whole week and just warming it up left over. Last up, one of my favorites of the week. This is a low-carb asparagus chicken Alfredo. So to start with for this, I took one chicken breast, sliced it on the diagonal into little thin strips, putting it into a medium mixing bowl, topping it with 2 teaspoons of Tony's Creole seasoning. Just getting a spoon and mixing that around until all of our chicken is nicely coated with our seasoning. And if you have time to do this, just stick this in your fridge for at least an hour. If not, you could stick it in your fridge while you are making the Alfredo sauce. Now, the original recipe for this is from Low Carbology, and I tried to follow her Alfredo sauce. So in a small saucepan over medium heat, I'm adding 6 tablespoons of unsalted butter. Now, her recipe, she has no garlic in her Alfredo sauce, and I could not bear to make Alfredo sauce without garlic. So I am adding half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of minced garlic to that butter once it's nice and warm, and just whisk it in until it is fragrant. To that, I'm adding 1 cup of heavy cream and whisking that in as well. And we're just gonna let this come up slowly to a simmer and not let it boil because we don't want the fats to separate and get all messy, and then let it cook for a couple minutes. Adding a little pinch of salt to that and a dash of ground nutmeg. It looks like a lot because it's spread out on the surface like that, but it's, you know, somewhere between 1/8 of a teaspoon and 1/4 of a teaspoon. To that, I'm adding in half a cup of grated Parmesan cheese. I did go ahead and cut the heat off at this point, and I am just whisking that in. And I will say that I didn't find this to be as thick of an Alfredo sauce as I would normally like, so I did go back after this and add another 1/4 of a cup of grated Parmesan cheese to this to get to the thickness that I desired, and just sticking this sauce to the side to sit while we get started on the chicken. So back in a large skillet, adding a couple tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil over medium to medium high heat, and adding in that chicken that we seasoned earlier. And this recipe is only making 2 servings. You just really need to cook the chicken. If it's sliced thinly like this, just for a couple minutes on each side will get it cooked all the way through. And once it is, I am just gonna go ahead and give it a nice toss here, and then remove the chicken to a separate dish for a second so I can empty out this extra olive oil that's in our pan, because I don't want that to mix with our Alfredo sauce and create that mess that I was talking about earlier. After I do that, I put my chicken back in, and we're gonna add some asparagus. Now we're using 6 ounces of asparagus for this recipe that I went ahead and broke the knobby ends off of, and then cut into little bite-sized pieces, and then I steamed it in the microwave for 3 minutes. And we are just sprinkling that right on top of our chicken, and I'm just gonna stir this around a little before adding in 2/3 a cup of that Alfredo sauce that we just made. And then I'm just gonna stir this in and toss it around a little bit until everything's fully coated and nice and warm. And that's that. Really pretty simple. Even with making the sauce, it doesn't take that long. And here it is plated up. Now, I didn't have any shredded Parmesan cheese in the fridge, but I had a little container of shaved parm. So I just topped it with some of that I crumbled in my hands, and a little bit of parsley. This was so good, and you could easily just double this recipe to have leftovers for a keto lunch the next day. So there you go. That's this week's keto dinner ideas, keto chicken recipes. If you liked this video, please give us a thumbs up, share it with your friends, anybody you know that's looking for some easy keto chicken recipes, and make sure to subscribe to our channel with your notification bells on so you never miss one of our weekly keto cooking videos. And until next time, bye y'all.